Why does evil feel older than the first human heartbeat? Why does darkness seem to stalk every generation, as if it had always been here? Why do the shadows of pride and rebellion reach further back than the dawn of our world? And could it be that the battle you sense in your own life today began long before the first sunrise over Earth? If you love uncovering the Bible's hidden truths, consider subscribing. Your support helps keep these stories alive and the light of Scripture shining. The Scriptures tell us of a time when there was only harmony, a dimension of pure light, not the soft glow of candles, but a radiance so alive it seemed to breathe. This was the command center of all creation, the throne room of the Almighty, where every being moved in perfect unity with their Maker. Angels of every rank and order filled this realm, not the harmless cherubs painted on Renaissance ceilings, but mighty warriors whose very presence could shatter mountains, messengers whose voices carried the weight of eternity, and ministers of divine law who upheld the fabric of reality itself. Each one bore a reflection of the Creator's glory, like countless mirrors turned toward the same blazing source. And among these countless lights stood one who shone brighter than them all. His name was Lucifer, light-bearer, morning star. Ezekiel 28 says he was full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. His covering was adorned with every precious stone: sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, a living crown of color. His very being was a symphony. Scripture suggests that instruments were built into him, so that every step was a note in heaven's eternal song. Lucifer walked among the stones of fire, the very heart of God's presence. He held the highest position granted to any created being, the anointed cherub who covers, guarding the throne of the Almighty himself. To the eyes of heaven, he was the pinnacle of divine artistry, the masterpiece of God's craftsmanship. And yet, somewhere in that perfection, something small began to stir. Not a storm, but a whisper. Not a shout, but a thought. It was not planted by God. It rose from within. Pride, the deadliest seed in the garden of the soul. Lucifer looked upon his beauty, his power, his position, and his gaze shifted from the glory of the Creator to the reflection of himself. Then came the 5 declarations recorded in Isaiah 14, the manifesto of his rebellion. I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. 5 times, I will. Not thy will, but I will. And with each vow, the crack in heaven's harmony widened. It makes me think, if even a flawless world, filled with perfect knowledge and perfect beauty, could birth rebellion, then what does that tell us about the nature of freedom we hold in our own hands today? This was no passing mood, no moment of envy. It was a calculated resolve to overturn the very order of the universe, to replace the Creator with the created. And in that decision, the stage was set for a war unlike any the cosmos had ever known. What does it take to convince 1/3 of heaven to turn against its Creator? What kind of words could make beings who have seen perfect light choose eternal darkness? And if deception can work in a place where truth is all you've ever known, what hope do we have in a world like ours? Lucifer's desire to ascend was not a solitary dream. It became a campaign. The Scriptures hint at the magnitude of his persuasion, and his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. Revelation 12:4. Those stars are the angels, and a third of them chose him over God. Imagine it. Countless angels who had stood before the throne, who had felt the very pulse of divine glory, now choosing to follow a created being against the eternal God. How does that happen? Not with brute force, but with words, with promises, with a vision of something better. Revolutions, even in our human history, are rarely born on the battlefield. They begin in whispers, in questions that erode trust, in the quiet reshaping of loyalties. Just as in ancient courts where ambitious generals spread discontent to topple kings, Lucifer moved from angel to angel, planting seeds of doubt about the wisdom of the Almighty. Perhaps he said, "Why serve when you can rule?" Or, "Why reflect light when you could be the source of it?" But the most venomous suggestion of all, why bow to one who keeps you from becoming all you could be? The danger of such lies is not in their size, but in their seed-like nature. A single idea, once planted, can grow even in the soil of perfection. And here's the disturbing thought. If 1/3 of the heavenly host, with perfect vision of God's glory, could be persuaded to rebel, do we really believe we are immune to deception in a fallen world? The rebellion escalated until open conflict was inevitable. Revelation 12:7-8 says, "And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. And the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not." This was not the clang of swords and shields, but the collision of authority and truth against ambition and lies. Imagine formations of light like living rivers, flowing in perfect synchrony under Michael's command. Imagine the rebel hosts moving with the frenzy of those who fight not for justice, but for the satisfaction of their own pride. In this war, every angel was more fearsome than the mightiest army mankind has ever fielded. Think of the armies of Alexander, Napoleon, or the legions of Rome. And yet here, a single angel could outmatch them all. And still, the rebels fought as if their cause could overturn the foundations of creation itself. But rebellion against the source of all power is not merely immoral, it is impossible. Isaiah 45:9 asks, "Shall the clay say to him that fashioneth it, What makest thou?" Creation cannot dethrone the Creator. The end was certain before the first strike. Jesus himself testified, "I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven." Luke 10:18. It was not a slow retreat. It was an expulsion, sudden, blinding, irreversible. One heartbeat, he was the anointed cherub. The next, he was the enemy, cast down with those who had chosen his cause. Stripped of the light that had once clothed them, the rebels became a shadow of what they were. They retained their intelligence, their power, their knowledge of heavenly order, but twisted now, turned toward destruction. Pride had changed their very nature. And then, the war shifted. Heaven was cleansed, but the battlefield moved. A new realm had been brought into being. Time, space, and matter. In its vastness hung a small blue and green jewel, Earth. And here lies one of the Bible's most haunting openings. "And the earth was without form, and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." Genesis 1:2. The Hebrew tohu vabohu means more than emptiness. It carries the sense of desolation after judgment. Was this the scar of the first battle? The residue of cosmic war? Ancient myths, Babylon's Marduk versus Tiamat, Egypt's Ra versus Apophis, echo with images of order overcoming chaos. But the scriptures reveal the original reality behind every imitation. Not rival gods, but the one true God asserting his will against the rebellion of created beings. Then came the voice, "Let there be light," Genesis 1:3. It was not just the dawn of physical illumination, but the declaration of divine sovereignty. Light invaded the darkness like an army reclaiming captured ground. And yet, God did something surprising. He did not destroy the rebels outright. He allowed them to remain, not in heaven, but within this physical creation. Here is a question worth pondering. If God could end this war instantly, but chooses not to, is that an act of mercy, or a strategy to reveal something deeper to the watching universe? The answer may lie in the nature of love and justice. Love does not force loyalty. Justice does not act without exposing the truth. Perhaps God's plan was not only to defeat rebellion, but to reveal, beyond dispute, what rebellion produces, and what His kingdom truly is. From this moment forward, the war would not be fought with the raw splendor of heaven's armies, but through the choices of free beings in a physical world. The weapons would be truth versus deception, trust versus doubt, humility versus pride. The fallen angels, now demons, regrouped like exiled generals, plotting their return. They knew they could never storm heaven again, so they would target what God valued most in His coming creation. They would take the battlefield of earth and turn it into a war zone. It is in this dark transition that Earth ceases to be just a planet. It becomes the front line, and humanity, not yet created, is about to be placed in the middle of it. If a third of heaven fell with perfect knowledge, what will we choose with far less? And what does it say about the world we were born into, that its very soil was the ground zero of a war that began before time? The heavens were quiet now. The rebellion had been driven out like a storm pushed beyond the horizon. But the war wasn't over. It had only moved. Picture it as the opening frame of a great war film. The camera pulls back from the smoke of a battlefield in heaven to reveal a planet hanging in the void. Earth, dark, silent, bruised. Genesis says, "The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." Then, a voice. Not like thunder, but as if thunder itself had been created by this sound. "Let there be light." The words strike like the first salvo of a counterattack. Light explodes across the void, chasing shadows like enemy troops fleeing before a charge. The sequence unfolds with the precision of a commander reclaiming lost ground. Day 1. Light separated from darkness, a visible line drawn like a front in the war. Day 2. The sky stretched out like a vast canopy, a shield over the battlefield. Day 3. Land rises from the waters like regiments emerging from the fog, and green life bursts forth as a declaration. This ground is ours. Day 4. The sun and moon set into place like great watchtowers, governing day and night. Day 5. The seas and skies swarm with life, scouts and messengers reclaiming once empty realms. Day 6. The land teems with creatures, and then, the most unexpected move yet, the camera moves in tight. Hands form a figure from the dust, deliberate, intricate, almost like a sculptor preparing a statue for the palace court. Then the creator leans close. Breath enters clay. Eyes open. A chest rises. "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion." Genesis 1:26. No angel had ever been granted this. Not Michael. Not Gabriel. Humanity is given the imago Dei. Not just a physical form, but the spark of divine reasoning, moral will, and relational capacity. And with it, dominion over earth. Cut to the enemy's face. the once radiant cherub, now the dark general of a fallen army. His eyes burn with fury. The king has planted a living emblem in the heart of his territory. This is more than defiance. It is a direct challenge to his claim. Eden fills the frame, a lush forward operating base behind enemy lines. Rivers glint like silver, leaves sway in a warm wind, the air heavy with the scent of life. Yet Eden is not merely a retreat. It is a launch point. The command is clear. Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it. Genesis 1:28. This is a kingdom expansion order, a mission to extend God's order beyond Eden's borders. At the center, two trees rise like monuments. The tree of life, a symbol of unbroken relationship with the source. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, a test, a point of decision. The king's law is clear. Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree thou shalt not eat of it. Genesis 2:16-17. And yet the king does not fortify the garden with walls or gates. No angels stand guard at this stage. The freedom given here is staggering. In earthly war, generals control every movement of their troops. Here the commander gives his soldiers complete liberty, even the liberty to fail. The serpent appears in a low tracking shot, moving silent through the grass, scales catching the light, eyes glinting with calculation. He does not roar. He whispers, "Yea, hath God said." The tone is almost casual, but the question is a surgical strike. Doubt is the enemy's first weapon, denial the second. Eve listens. The serpent circles her mind with promises. Ye shall not surely die. Ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Genesis 3:4-5. The soundtrack builds, low strings, a heartbeat rhythm. Adam watches, torn between loyalty and desire. Then, the bite. A single act, but it hits like an explosion. Adam takes a turn, and the soundscape shifts. The warm tones drain into cold. In a cutaway, shadows creep in from the garden's edges. The air grows heavy. Somewhere the enemy smiles. But the next scene is not what he expected. Footsteps. Not the pounding march of judgment, but the measured pace of a king entering his own garden. Where art thou? Genesis 3-9. It is the voice of authority, but also of pursuit, not of destruction, but of restoration. Judgment comes swiftly. The serpent cursed to crawl, the ground cursed to resist, yet in the same breath, the king fires a promise across the ages. I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Genesis 3:15. Visually, it is the perfect war movie setup. The hero has been wounded, but the enemy has just been told how the story will end. The film flashes forward in rapid montage. Cain lifting a stone against Abel. Giants striding through a corrupted world in Noah's day. Pharaoh's soldiers tearing Hebrew infants from their mothers. Herod's troops sweeping through Bethlehem under cover of night. Each moment, the serpent strikes at the heel. But each time, the head remains, awaiting the day of crushing. Back in Eden, Adam and Eve step into exile, but not in the rags of defeat. The king himself clothes them in garments of skin, a silent prophecy of the sacrifice that will one day cover all shame. The final shot pulls away, the earth turning slowly in the void, battle lines drawn across time itself. The narrator's voice is quiet, almost a whisper. If the enemy's greatest fear is not our weakness, but what God can do through it, then perhaps our wounds are not the end, but the very weapon he will use for victory. I remember the look in the enemy's eyes when Adam and Eve stepped out of Eden. He thought it was finished. He thought the war was his. But what he didn't see, what he could not have imagined, was that the very moment humanity fell was the moment the king began his counterattack. It started not with an army, but with a sentence. The words were like an arrow shot across time. "And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. He shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." Genesis 3:15. That was the first prophecy, the first gospel. It was not a wish, it was a declaration. The serpent's head would be crushed. From that moment on, every movement in history would be shaped by those words. Every battle, every rescue, every act of mercy was part of the same campaign. The enemy struck early. Cain, consumed with jealousy, rose up against his brother Abel. The soil drank Abel's blood, and the enemy must have thought the promise had been severed. But then came Seth, a new branch, a living continuation of the line. The world grew darker. Genesis 6 says, "The earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence." Every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The enemy's tactic was clear: fill the earth with so much corruption that there would be no pure vessel for the promised seed. Then the king moved. The sky darkened, and the first drops of rain became a relentless bombardment. The floodwaters rose, not just as judgment, but as a reset. On the waters floated the ark, like a fortress of salvation, carrying Noah and his family safely through the chaos. When the waters receded, the promise still stood. Generations later, the serpent tightened his grip around a people chosen to carry the promise. In Egypt, they were beaten, enslaved, crushed under Pharaoh's hand. Exodus 1:14 says, "And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage." In all their service, wherein they made them serve, was with rigor. The plan was simple. If he couldn't kill the lion outright, he would grind it into dust until it forgot who it was. But the king raised a deliverer. Moses stood before Pharaoh, and the plagues fell like precision strikes. Water to blood, darkness swallowing the land, and finally, the death of every firstborn in homes not marked by the lamb's blood. This was more than liberation. It was prophecy in motion, a shadow of the Lamb yet to come. At the Red Sea, the enemy's chariots thundered in pursuit. But the waters split, walls of crystal rising on either side, and Israel crossed on dry ground. When Pharaoh's army followed, the sea closed over them, swallowing the might of Egypt in a single blow. In the desert, the king gave his law, not as a prison, but as a battle manual for a holy nation. The tabernacle stood at the center of the camp like a mobile headquarters, a visible reminder that the commander was among his people. The campaign pushed into Canaan. At Jericho, the walls fell without a single sword strike, brought down by the sound of trumpets and the obedience of faith. Territory after territory fell. But not all strongholds were destroyed. The enemy had his footholds, and those footholds would become problems for generations to come. The serpent changed tactics. No longer relying only on armies and sieges, he began to work from the inside. False gods appeared, idols glimmered on high places, and the hearts of the people began to drift. The battlefield was no longer only land. It was loyalty. So the king sent prophets, Elijah, who stood on Mount Carmel and cried, "The God that answereth by fire, let him be God." 1 Kings 18:24. Fire fell from heaven, consuming the altar, leaving no doubt who ruled the skies, Isaiah spoke of a child to come. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Isaiah 9-6. Jeremiah wept for a people who refused to turn back, warning them that rebellion would open the gates to destruction. The warnings were ignored. The enemy advanced. Assyrian banners appeared on the horizon, their armies sweeping the northern kingdom into exile. Babylon followed, breaking through Jerusalem's walls. The temple, the heartbeat of the nation, was set ablaze. From a human point of view, this was disaster. The enemy must have thought the war was over. But even in the ashes, the promise was alive. In foreign lands, the king's agents rose. Daniel refused to bow, praying openly despite the lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood in the furnace, their survival a declaration that the king's power could not be burned away. In Persia, the enemy plotted genocide through Haman's scheme. But Esther stepped into the royal court, risking her life to reverse the decree. In Jerusalem, Nehemiah rebuilt the walls with a sword in one hand and a trowel in the other, fortifying a city the serpent wanted erased. The centuries rolled on like the slow march of an army through shifting terrain. Kingdoms rose and fell. Persia, with its vast reach and royal decrees. Greece, bringing a common tongue and ideas that would ripple across nations. Rome, building roads like veins of stone, carrying armies, merchants, and whispers from one end of the empire to the other. From a soldier's view, it was as if the world was being shaped, fortified, connected, prepared for something monumental. Each empire thought it was building for its own glory, but I could see it. The king was using even the enemy's tools to lay the groundwork for his next move. And then came silence. 400 years without a prophet's voice. No visions, no dreams that burned with divine fire. No angel stepping out of the unseen to deliver a message. It was the kind of quiet before battle, when even the wind seems to hold its breath. When every sound feels louder than it should. Farmers sowed their fields, merchants haggled in markets, children played in the streets. But the heavens seemed watchful. The enemy mistook the quiet for retreat. He thought the promise had faded into myth, a story told by the old to keep the young from straying too far. He worked in the shadows, weaving new layers of deception. Philosophies flourished that left no room for the God of Abraham. Power shifted into the hands of rulers who bowed to no one but themselves. The faithful were fewer, their hope tested with every year that passed without a sign. Yet the silence was not empty. Beneath the surface, pieces were moving into place. The law had been scattered like seed into synagogues across the known world, ready to be read in every city. The Greek language bound distant peoples together with words they could all understand. Roman roads made it possible for a message to travel faster than ever before. From where I stood, it was like watching two armies take position, one cloaked in shadow, the other waiting for a signal. And I knew, as surely as I knew the sound of a trumpet before a charge, that the next move would break the war wide open. Silence is not surrender. It is preparation. And in that stillness, I could almost hear it. The first stirrings of an invasion, not of soldiers or steel, but of light. The darkness had no idea how close it was to being shattered. Why didn't God crush the serpent at Eden and end the war instantly? Could it be that justice must be demonstrated before all creation? and that love can only be proven through choice. Notice how every rescue in history wasn't just about that moment. It was another move toward the promised seed. Does that mean our own history is also part of a larger plan we can't fully see? If God was faithful to guard His promise for thousands of years, what does that say about His promises to us today? The silence broke not with the roar of battle, but with the cry of a child. No banners flew, no armies marched, no thrones trembled. At least not yet. It happened in Bethlehem, a village the empire barely noticed, a place of stone houses and narrow streets where shepherds were more common than soldiers. And yet, in that quiet corner, the king launched the most decisive strike in the history of the war. I still remember that night as if the sky itself had turned to flame. The fields lay dark and still, and then, light. Not the cold light of steel or fire, but something warm, alive, and unstoppable. The air vibrated with voices, thousands strong. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. It was a battle cry disguised as a lullaby, the announcement of an invasion the enemy never saw coming. The child lay wrapped in cloth, asleep in a manger, his first breaths quiet, yet heavier with destiny than all the crowns of the world. The serpent did not understand, not at first. But when the threat became clear, he struck in his usual way. Herod's soldiers swept through Bethlehem with swords drawn, leaving grief in every street. Mothers clutched empty blankets. Fathers stood broken in doorways. But Joseph had already fled into the night, carrying the child to safety. Years passed, no battles, no speeches, just the sound of saw and hammer in a carpenter's home in Nazareth. Yet I could feel it, a tension, a gathering of power, the long inhale before the shout. And then came the day at the Jordan. He stepped into the water where John was baptizing, and the prophet's voice rang out like the sounding of a trumpet. Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. As he rose from the river, the Spirit descended, and a voice from heaven declared, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." It was the official unveiling of the champion, the signal that the campaign had entered its next phase. The enemy struck immediately, drawing him into the wilderness. Hunger gnawed at him after 40 days of fasting, and the serpent offered bread. He took him to the temple's height, offering safety, to a mountain's peak, offering all the kingdoms of the world in exchange for a bow. It was Eden's temptation all over again: desire, pride, power. But this time, every blow was parried with truth. It is written. The serpent retreated, wounded and furious. From there, the light advanced village by village, life by life. The blind opened their eyes to see daylight for the first time. The lame felt the ground firm beneath newly strengthened feet. The dead rose, their names called back from silence. Crowds pressed in from every direction, drawn not just by power, but by the words he spoke, words that pierced deeper than any blade. But the enemy had allies in the shadows. Jealous hearts in high places twisted truth into lies. They accused him of blasphemy, conspired behind closed doors, and waited for their chance. That chance came in Jerusalem during Passover, when the city was crowded and restless. The arrest was swift and secret. The trials were mockeries of justice, carried out under the cover of night. By morning, he was bloodied and beaten, paraded through the streets with a cross on his back. Outside the city gates, they nailed him to the wood and lifted him high for all to see. The crowd mocked, the soldiers gambled, the serpent rejoiced. But I remembered the prophecy. He was wounded for our transgressions. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. The cross was not the enemy's victory. It was the king's trap. The champion was absorbing the curse, taking into himself every weapon the enemy had. When he breathed his last, the earth quaked, the rocks split, and the temple veil tore from top to bottom. It was as if heaven and earth both knew what had just happened. 3 days later, the war's outcome was sealed. The stone rolled away, the tomb stood empty, and the champion walked out alive, the marks in his hands now trophies of triumph. Death itself had been stripped of its power. The serpent's head had been crushed, just as promised at the dawn of time. From that moment, the campaign went global. His followers carried the message along Roman roads, across seas, into palaces and prisons alike. The king has won. The grave is broken. The light has come. Empires would try to silence it. Persecution would try to crush it. But the light only burned brighter. And now, after centuries, I can tell you this. The war still rages, but it is a desperate fight for the losing side. The enemy knows his time is short. He fights not to win, but to take as many as he can with him. Yet every time a heart turns to the king, it is another blow to the darkness. This is the message you must not miss. The invasion of light was never just about a moment in history. It is about you. It is about whether you will stand in the shadows or step into the kingdom that cannot be shaken. The victory has been won, but the choice is still yours. I have watched kings rise and fall, seen nations turn to dust, but the banner of the king still flies. One day, the skies will split open, and he will return. Not in the silence of Bethlehem, but in the thunder of glory, leading the armies of heaven. On that day, the war will end. On that day, the light will fill everything. Until then, the light marches on. And now, you know the truth. The war is real. The victory is certain. But the front line runs straight through every human heart. When the final trumpet sounds and the commander returns, the question will not be whether the light has won, but whether you stood in it